Joe Biden. I never heard any mention of their supporters, millions of them, tens of millions of them, who he will now, it appears, be the president for again. And he did say at that news conference today that, he wanted to try to reach out to those people. I'm not sure when that outreach was, other than sort of broadly saying he wants to heal this country and talking about his agenda. We did not hear from Donald Trump tonight.
That's a good point. Do we know if there's been any communication this evening between the two camps?
I have asked everyone who I can think would know that information up to it, including Donald Trump himself, and I don't know yet, Lester. It's not indicated. I think this race is over yet, so I'd be surprised if there's been a phone call between them.
All right, Garrett Haig, thank you at the headquarters there, and we heard again from the Harris folks that she will speak sometime that we heard tonight. Brief remarks to the crowd, telling them to go home, back to. We've seen Donald Trump win in Wisconsin, now in a position. I'm sorry, not win in Wisconsin.
Minnesota.
That.
Harris has won
Minnesota. We've also got those other calls, I believe, coming in, and you would CD2. Fig to 270 here. I will say, is one of the conversations here about what this look like for former president here and the dynamics back home where we are in Washington between the House, the Senate, the White House. You talked about, Ryan, the possibility of a Democratic control of House, Republican control of the Senate. I do wonder, and I think the question is out there, what does that Democratic quote-unquote resistance look like, not just in Congress, but more broadly across the country? I think one thing you've heard from Democrats, some of them are exhausted, right? And this was the case that Kamala Harris was trying to make. Like, we're all so tired of this. Let's move on. Let's have a fresh start. And I just wonder, on the Democratic side, what is the energy to sort of, again, quote, this here in this potential?
Well, and the Trump team has said they're afraid that he's going to be quote unquote impeached on day one, and that's been part of their message.
I mean, we are in this era of impeachment, right? I mean, as though there's an impeachment inquiry for every president that takes office. And we did talk a little bit about maybe there's areas for them to find common ground and work together on things. I think the more realistic outlook here is that the Democrats do and will view the Democratic-controlled House, if it turns out that way, and we're nowhere near to call it that, that they would become the left fence against whatever they see the Donald Trump agenda be. It would be beyond just stopping the legislation that he would put on the floor. There's a congressman by the name of Raskin who currently serves the ranking member on the Oversight Committee. If they win the majority, he would become the chair of the Oversight Committee. That would give him subpoena power. That would give him the opportunity to launch all these investigations into the Trump administration, much like his contemporary James Comer has done with the Biden administration. So there's a whole options the Democratic-led House could have should they win the majority. If they don't win the majority, then it's a whole different thing.
What does the retribution path look like, though, that we've heard so much about?
Well, that's
not what he said, but what he'll do.
That's the open question. I mean, will he go after his political rivals legally? What specifically does that look? Now, look, his aides and allies have tried to downplay that. They've said, look, that's not what he meant. You're taking that out of context. But it is what he said. And so...
he's got supporters
he
who
said just days ago that it'll be, in his words, nasty in the beginning, right? Which I think Democrats took as an allusion to the potential for this so-called enemies list as Vice President Harris.
Absolutely. And the first thing he says he's going to do is fire Jack Smith, of course, the special counsel who's brought these charges against him. So that's the first act, potentially, of retribution, if you want to put it into that category. But I do think there's a big question mark. I have asked him about it in my interview with him over a year ago. What specifically do you mean by retribution? He wouldn't get specific. I think a lot of reporters have tried to drill down on exactly what that would look like. And much like the mass deportation plan, there aren't a lot of specifics. There's not a policy paper that's been put out to give people a sense of what it would look like or how it would be carried out. But there is a sense that he already is amassing a team of people.
And the first signal will probably be who he appoints as his attorney general.
I was about to say that,
Yeah, because, the one thing that the United States government puts itself on is the independence of the justice. That they don't take their marching orders from the president after they're appointed to that job. Donald Trump has said multiple times that he doesn't think it should be like that anymore. So if he picks someone who's very dyingly loyal to him as attorney general, something he didn't do when he appointed Jeff Sessions, the first I think that'll be our first signal as to just how much he's going to use the DOJ.
Who does he listen to?
In general, or
in general?
Kellyanne Conway's still, I mean, outside advisor, but still one.
He listens. That's right.
We talked to somebody who we might see as the next Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, possibly.
Yeah, he's also somebody I think we've all talked to in different contexts. He's somebody who will sort of listen to people who are he happens to be with in the moment. And I think we've talked about the experience of he'll riff with you just even as and he'll do and concerning. That's what Republicans in some ways find appealing.
Let me send a big out to Garrett Haake at the Trump headquarters. Garrett?
Lester, and I could jump in on having covered Trump for a long time. The question of who he listens to is almost everyone, and it can be anyone around him, from his friends at Mar-a-Lago to elected, to the folks who find and collect his phone number to try to reach out to him on any issue. In fact, in many cases, there's almost a penalty applied to people who are on his payroll, take his or his staff. In some cases, he trusts you less than the people who might be people use as friends and peers. Although tonight, extraordinarily campaign managers to try to get them here to speak tonight. Indicative of what has been a campaign that was, at least in Trump standards, out the kind of drama and backbiting that defined his two previous campaigns and his White House. And I think look at that model as he starts to think about how he's going to staff his White House and build out his cabinet might be important. I can tell you there's already a lot of discussion, some of it among reporters, some of it among staff, many of whom are quite superstitious about discussing it before tonight, about what the transition is going to look like, who might be in line for various appointments. I can tell you from talking to sources in the donor community and a lot of lawmakers who Ryan and I cover at Capitol Hill, particularly in the Senate, people starting to get a little bit sharp-elbowed about viewing what cabinet positions might be available to them, what opportunities might be available to second Trump administration. I think there was a thinking about Republican senators and whether or not they would potentially be asked to serve in a cabinet if the Senate was narrowly divided to deplete on numbers on other things they have. But in margin in the Senate, anybody from even remotely find themselves considered for a cabinet position. And the cabinet's going to do a lot of work here, especially if the House ultimately ends up controlled by Democrats. Donald Trump made it clear in his first term, he's not at all executive authority on that by the Supreme Court. Backstop since he's been out of office, ruling on immunity, essentially saying any official acts can't be criminally prosecuted. And the politics laid out on the campaign trail, particularly his economic plan, the tariffs that he wants to put in place, are things that he can do unilaterally and may begin doing quite quickly, at least if he's going to keep all the promises that he's laid out for himself in the first early week of his campaign. Guys, I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to you in the studio.
All right, Garrett, thanks very much. I've stepped over to the big word with Tom Yamas to drill down on where we are right now. We, NBC News, race yet. We still got Donald Trump at 266. What's his path now to finish up this?
Yeah, and we just want to make sure, we're absolutely right about all this. At some point, we will call Alaska. That almost always goes. That gets him to 269. You come over to Maine again. We haven't called the races in Maine yet. Maine, like Nebraska, gives out its electoral votes by popular vote. It'll probably go blue, and then by congressional districts. And congressional district 2, CD2, it's usually a red district. And once we do that, you can see his number there, Lester. It hasn't happened at this point yet. We expect that to happen at some point. We will project that once it happens, but we're just not there yet. We're not trying to keep anything away from former President Trump. We're just not there in the night yet.
Right, and so the headline of this night would be, because you went through state by state, and we kept seeing the same thing, underperform. Is that right?
The story is he overperformed in the rural areas. She underperformed in the urban areas, in the counties. She needed to win. She was Biden pretty much in all the battleground states. And when we started the night, Lester, remember, we even did this last night on Nightly News, we showed you the easiest path for Trump. And it's not easy to become president, obviously, but the easiest path for him was to hold North Carolina. He did that, flip Georgia and Pennsylvania, and he could get to the White House. And tonight he's done that.
So you'd walked us through that. And so
we're still in Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona.
So officially we're at 266 now?
We're at 266. Right now we're at 260. And we're waiting on the last in the congressional districts in Maine.
But this some. down the stretch,
It's an interesting question. We had a call with the Trump campaign a few days ago, and we're bullish on their sort of prospects. But again, on those calls, they're sometimes trying to spin you, and sometimes you take this with a grain of salt. Are they right? It turns out on that call they were what they were their own early voting. Once early voting started coming back in some of these states and Republicans were matching Democrats, that was a big sign to Democrats like, listen, wait a minute, things may be changing here. It may not be as easy as we thought. And no one thought it was going to be easy. Everyone thought it was going to be a coin flip. It was going to be so tight. But now looking back, and we can look back a little bit and maybe Monday morning quarterback and say there were things there for Democrats to be a little nervous.
And Hallie, obviously Democrats have a lot ahead of them now as they try to work through this.
Yeah.
But that takes time.
Yeah,
These
and
things will get turned even in 4 years.
And at this moment, I think there is, by all accounts and by the reporting that our teams are doing, a shell shock work to try to turn out the vote